I'm Carole Taylor. This episode of Journal will wade into the legally and socially complex world of Aboriginal rights, private property rights, and the provincial government's role in all of this. You know, earlier this spring, we got our first look at how government intends to bring our laws in harmony with the intentions of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP. The resulting BC Land Act was introduced in the legislature with fanfare. Oh, but boy, it landed with a thud. The headlines were brutal. No consultation. First Nations will co-manage with government all of our Crown land. That's 94% of the province. Government promises private land will be protected. Or will it? And how does this work? Lawyers, experts, and politicians, they all chimed in on both sides of the debate, some saying it was simply what the courts had ordered, and that by introducing DRIPA, the province had basically already made this commitment. But others saw it as a concession too big to swallow, made behind closed doors, with potentially devastating unintended consequences. Given the outcry, it was not a surprise that the act was pulled from the legislative schedule to be reconsidered. Then last week, in further support of reconciliation, our government recognized Haida Aboriginal title over all of Haida Gwaii. So again, what does this mean? How will it work? And is private property in Haida Gwaii really exempt? One man who is a respected legal voice examining all these issues is Thomas Isaac. Considered a national authority on Aboriginal law, he was named one of Canada's top 25 most influential lawyers. Well, now he's got a front row seat analyzing the provincial government's moves on this file, namely Crown land negotiations and the Haida Gwaii transfer of title. Back with Thomas Isaac in a moment. Welcome back. And thank you, Thomas, for joining me. This is a complicated discussion. I think we might as well start with the most recent, which is the Haida recent decision. First of all, maybe you can tell me, what does it exactly mean when you say Aboriginal title?
So thank you, Carole. Aboriginal title, we've actually got some very clear direction from the Supreme Court of Canada on what Aboriginal title means. Former Chief Justice McLaughlin described it as the highest form of Aboriginal right. It is a right to the land itself. That's a direct quote from the court. And it's an exclusive right to the land. So even the Crown, for example, needs to ask permission to go onto Aboriginal title land unless the Crown is prepared to justifiably infringe that title. So it's the highest form of right, and it's an exclusive right to land.
So when you say exclusive, what about property rights?
So exclusive means exclusive. Until the court gives us a different definition of the word exclusive, it means exclusive. And likewise, fee simple rights, private property rights that people hold, whether in British Columbia or other parts of Canada, are also a form of exclusive right to land. And so therein lies the challenge by declaring Aboriginal title over fee simple land.
It's different from a treaty.
Well, it's different. This, it's a very good point. This is really a key point in the discussion, is that in a treaty, all the clauses in a treaty, if I could put it to you this way, are apples to apples. They're all constitutionally protected. So in a treaty, if you have limits on Aboriginal title, they also get constitutionally protected. The challenge we have with the agreement that's been announced is that while Aboriginal title is a constitutional right, the agreement isn't constitutionally protected and can, as a matter of law, have no effect on the constitutional right. And this issue is not open for debate. This is a fundamental tenet of Canadian law that isn't restricted to simply Aboriginal law.
So, Thomas, so you're telling me that this agreement that was presented to the public, where the Premier promised that, don't worry, private property will be protected in Haida Gwaii, that doesn't have weight?
It doesn't have weight in terms of the constitutional right. And again, this isn't for the sake of being provocative. It's simply a a key tenet of Canadian law. And so that's why these things need to be done very thoughtfully and prudently, because Aboriginal title is a big deal. If you acknowledge that a First Nation has Aboriginal title, you're saying really to the world that no one else has a right to that land. Now, there's a second element to this, and there are certain things that go along with Aboriginal title. So in legal terms, we call it sui generis. Translated, it's unique. It's something different in Canadian law. One of the unique features of Aboriginal title is that it can only be given away to the Crown. It cannot be alienated to any other party. Now again, this is a key tenet of law. So the notion of acknowledging Aboriginal title on top of private property rights is, as a matter of law, impossible under Aboriginal title, because First Nations can't give any rights on Aboriginal title land except to the Crown.
And so those private property owners, and there are some, wouldn't be able to sell their property.
Well, I don't know whether they can sell it. I mean, I think you raise, again, another very fundamental question, which gets into the practical realities of reconciliation and why we need to be, again, thoughtful and prudent in terms of what we're doing. I think really the thing now to watch for is what the market reaction is to this. One of the things that, and I should say I'm nonpartisan and proudly independent, one thing I can say is that the government has said, well, we've been living under this uncertainty. And as a practicing lawyer, I have a very vibrant practice in every province and territory of Canada. I simply challenge that proposition. We're doing lots of business here in British Columbia. We live with the reality of claims of Aboriginal title. And so whatever is in place of those claims has to be more certain. And I certainly think that this agreement, as it's crafted, the fact that it's not constitutionally protected, doesn't create more certainty. And in fact, has raised many, many more questions, including the one that you raised about now what's the marketability of private property.
And so where do we go from here? Is it all final? It's been to the legislature. They've had the ceremonies. That's done?
Well, the agreement's final. The agreement's been signed. I think it raises questions about the authority of both parties to actually sign that agreement when it's not a treaty. The legislation has not been passed, so I think that remains open. I do think the bigger question for our great province is, what's our vision? Where are we going? And we have to remind ourselves we have approximately 200 First Nations in British Columbia. And so whatever models, whatever precedents we're putting in place have to be realistic given the realities that there's a whole bunch of First Nations, the majority of First Nations in this province that don't have agreements. In some cases don't have clean drinking water, don't have access to education and healthcare services equal to other British Columbians. And so I think it does raise much bigger questions of what's our game plan and what's our vision for our province. And this is an issue I see across the country. If I may say one other thing, I frequently hear from governments about uncertainty. And again, as a practicing lawyer who acts for industry, acts for public governments, and Indigenous governments, the biggest uncertainty Canada faces in this area is public governments. The courts have been clear. Indigenous peoples have every right to pursue their rights. The Haida Nation has every right to pursue their rights. But it's public governments that are tasked by the court and our Constitution to put together a cogent, thoughtful public policy so we can actually all live together in harmony. And this is the biggest challenge I see for our country.
What I'm feeling right now is more uncertainty. Maybe it's better for lawyers. Maybe there won't be more lawsuits coming out of it. But now no one quite knows how this is going to work. For the other 200 or more First Nations in BC, has this set the table for them? Is everybody now going to seek title rather than treaty or negotiations?
Well, I think it's quite reasonable for First Nations now to say, well, can we have a form of this agreement? I think it's fair for private landowners and businesses in BC to question whether this is actually leading to increased certainty. But absolutely, when the Haida Agreement was announced, I was in another hearing in Eastern Canada defending the rights of private landowners. And by the way, also arguing that First Nations deserve a remedy for outstanding claims of title, pro-reconciliation. But we need to balance these things. And I can tell you that that agreement was immediately raised in court in that hearing. And again, we are active everywhere in Canada, and it's an active discussion across the country now. I think the question to ask is it resulting in increased certainty? We don't live in an uncertain province. I disagree with the proposition that we are in uncertain times. There's business being done, there's projects being built and approved, and First Nations having a say in what's happening on the land base.
And we should also mention, it's not just private property owners, but it's these long-term leases, whether it's mining or forestry. They're all going to be wondering, well, what happens when I have to renegotiate? Is it a whole different world?
Well, Carole, what I'm hearing, and this is anecdotal at this point because it's so fresh, I don't have any studies to point to, but a lot of people are now asking, what's this mean for the rest of the province? Premier Eby's been quite clear that this is now possibly a template for how to do these. So that's another issue.
Let's take that question, and I'll come back after a short break and look at this BC Land Act and negotiations. Welcome back, and we sure left it hanging there, saying, okay, now we're going to move from a specific Haida agreement to the BC Land Act, which was introduced earlier in the legislature. And as I said, I think most people felt the way it was introduced was just a disaster because it got everybody's back up. What was interesting, the Premier just last week was interviewed by Stu McNish on Conversations Live, and he made it quite clear for the first time that he really doesn't intend to bring it back as a whole. I think he saw, this is not going to work, and he'll bring it back in pieces. Now, I'm not sure that's any better or more complicated, but the point is that the concept's still the same, as you started to bring up in last break, was, okay, well, what are the principles here? And if First Nations is wanting or expecting the rights agenda, how can we make that work? You talked about the BC Land Act when it first came out and said there are unprecedented consequences to this.
Yes, and most of my criticism was not about trying to open up discussions with First Nations and ensuring that they have a role, an appropriate role to play in the governing of the province. Is how are we going to govern the province? So you can barely get approvals through now without sharing jurisdiction or power. That's not an argument not to do the right thing, to be very clear. But if we're going to replace the already very challenging processes in this province, whether you're trying to build subdivisions, whether you're trying to build a mine, build roads or highways, if we're going to replace that with something, I think that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people should be insisting on a thoughtful, well laid out plan of how we get from here to there and what that looks like from a longer term perspective. In one of my commentaries, and again, I want to stress I'm nonpartisan, so I'm not picking on just this government. This has been an issue in British Columbia for decades of what I call election cycle public policy. And the challenge with this area is that it does not lend itself well to that kind of, I'm not a politician, and I understand the desire to make short-term wins and short-term decisions. The challenge is that this genie doesn't go back in the bottle, and we're dealing with very serious issues. Reconciliation is as serious an issue as this province has, and it demands the respect, in my view, of our public governments to ensure that what they're saying is fair and equitable to all, including other First Nations. There will be many First Nations that may be watching this that will know that, they don't have access to these kinds of agreements. They don't have mines in their backyards. They're struggling getting by just on a day-to-day basis. And I think as a province, we have to think, well, how are we going to make sure that everybody gets brought along in a fair, equitable way? And that demands tough decisions and leadership.
So what are some of the unintended consequences that would keep you awake at night?
Well, look, the Supreme Court of Canada has given actually a full legal tool to governments to govern. So this, again, there's sort of a myth that governments are incapable of governing in the face of Aboriginal issues, and sometimes really pointing the finger at Aboriginal people. And I think it's completely unfair. The Supreme Court of Canada, we've had over 70 decisions, almost more than 2 a year since they started rendering decisions since 1990 on Section 35. And we have a substantive body of case law. There's still a lot of gray areas, but we have a substantive body of case law. Governments need to govern and lead in this area. And again, I'm not just picking on the EB government. This is an issue that crosses all political lines in my experience. And I say it with the greatest of respect, but this issue demands leadership and it demands tough decisions. How are we going to govern British Columbia? What's our vision for British Columbia where we are all reconciled so that all 200 First Nations have a role? What does that look like? And we still have an economy and we can still pay for health and education for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And obviously that's a very challenging proposition. What we don't need are Band-Aid solutions that aren't thinking of a broader vision. That's my very strong view, because I don't think it's fair, and I think it causes more uncertainty in our social and economic lives.
I got this feeling that many people in British Columbia who are not involved with government or they're not First Nations are feeling that they're the only ones not being consulted. So you've got two blocks that are at the table, but for instance, look what happened with the docks on the Sunshine Coast, and all of a sudden people who've lived there maybe all their lives are feeling that maybe I can't even have a dock to tie up my boat. Or a very recent decision with Lillooet on the lake, where the government has made an agreement with them that they're, for certain weeks during the summer, the public is not allowed to go to the lake. And I can't help but think people are starting to look at these individual actualizations and say, okay, well then what does this mean for the other lakes in the province? What does this mean for other issues that involve, community interests?
Again, Carole, I agree. One of the biggest challenges, again, if we're serious about reconciliation, remember Chief Justice Lemaire ended Delgamuukw by saying, let's face it, we are all here to stay. And what that means, I believe, is that we've got to bring along all most British Columbians. We may not be able to bring everyone along. That includes the First Nations that aren't part of some of the key deals, and it includes non-Indigenous people. In the 1990s, I was chief treaty negotiator in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. And I spent the vast majority of my time doing public education. This is critical. If we're serious about reconciliation, we've got to bring everyone along. I think it's shameful that British Columbians aren't being consulted, that citizens on Haida Gwaii weren't consulted on the agreement, private landowners, so they could be part of what should be a celebration on Haida Gwaii, not people raising very serious concerns about, how can Aboriginal title ever possibly apply to fee simple land? And so I think we do a great disservice to reconciliation by not engaging in public education. If I may just say one other thing, back in 2016, I did an independent report for the Government of Canada on Métis rights. My number one recommendation was more education. People didn't understand. Lawyers didn't understand the law on Métis people. And this educational component, and I say in that report that education is essentially key to reconciliation. And reconciliation is more than platitudes. It's got to be based in concrete actions, but those actions have to be meaningful and, again, long-term.
And when you say education, part of the confusion is sitting in the public. Somebody says private property rights are sacrosanct. somebody says, oh no, well, under Aboriginal rights, they're secondary. So how do we even educate ourselves? How do we know where the truth is?
Right. So the question I would ask of the government, and again, this is going to sound quite critical, and I guess I am being quite critical, where are the briefing notes on the cogent legal theory that ties all this together? These are very, very important topics, not only for the Haida, for other Indigenous peoples, First Nations and Métis in this province, and very important for the rest of British Columbia. Where are the briefing packages on the cogent legal theory that brings this together? Where are the briefing packages on how we're going to ensure that the market doesn't react negatively on Haida Gwaii and elsewhere in British Columbia? Where are the briefing packages on how this agreement fits into a broader vision of reconciliation for other First Nations in this province and how we can bring along all British Columbians? So I feel quite strongly, I mean, this is one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here with you, is that I feel very strongly in public education and public discussion. We shouldn't be afraid of reconciliation. I welcome reconciliation. I'm pro-reconciliation. I'm pro-Haida. This is not a comment on the Haida at all, but it is a comment on public government and the need for us to bring along the majority of British Columbians. It's too important not to do it right.
And so there's a little bit of optimism in there that things might go better.
There is, a little bit.
Thank you, Thomas, for being with us.
Well, thank you very much.
Back in a moment. Most British Columbians really support reconciliation, and they welcome initiatives that remove barriers to participation by First Nations. The danger is, if done badly, causing individuals to feel their own rights are not being considered or protected, there could be a backlash to government's very important attempts to right past wrongs. Let me know your thoughts on our YouTube channel. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.